Hello S2, today's lesson is going to be on Viking battles. Specifically, we are going to be focusing on a battle in 1066. Now, if you ask most people about 1066, they'll probably tell you that that was the year of the Battle of Hastings. But the battle we're going to be focusing on is the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of records about the Vikings in battles apart from Stamford Bridge, and especially there's not much records in Scotland. So we will be more focusing on the Vikings trying to get power in England and the struggles that they had in England more than Scotland. But we will touch on Scotland as well. And hopefully through this we'll be able to demonstrate the Vikings' timeline from when they came to Britain to try and gain power from when they had eventually left altogether. So we've looked at this picture before, but we're just going to look at it briefly again, just as a reminder for the reasons that the Vikings originally came to Britain. They originally come into places like Lindisfarne and Iona to do these raids on these rich places like monasteries and churches, where they knew they could get a lot of wealth, a lot of money, and then take it back to Scandinavia. This, however, all changed with the invasion of the Great Viking Army in 1865, sometimes also known as the Great Heathen Army. Now, the England that the Vikings would be coming to in 865 was not the same as it is today. It wasn't one united region. So the Great Viking Army wouldn't be able to just go to England and take over one region and become leaders of the whole of England. There was kings in these 5 different regions. So it's going to be tough for them and difficult to actually take it all over. Now, we don't know exactly how many Vikings arrived with the Great Viking Army, but estimates are between 500 to 6,000 people. And this map shows that very quickly from when arriving in East Anglia, they make their way up and through England. And by 878, they've pretty much conquered the whole of England. Now, they don't have any great battles, and we don't have any great records actually describing what they were like, but most records speak about the fact that the Vikings just simply overpowered the Anglo-Saxon armies that they came up against. Not that the Vikings had any great structure to how they fought, they just overpowered the other armies who weren't quite ready for the Viking attacks. They very quickly went up and through the country and didn't give the Anglo-Saxons time to prepare. Now, the reason that the Vikings didn't have all of England by this point was because they were defeated at the Battle of Edington in 878. Now, initially they had actually pushed Alfred of Wessex, who was the king of this region, backwards and taken over the region, but Alfred was able to regroup and get together a bigger army. Now, as you said, the Vikings were not very structured in how they fought, but Alfred was a very good king and a leader of his army. So once Alfred got together a bigger and better army, he was able to defeat the Vikings by using better structured battle tactics, which the Vikings could not fight up against. So this is why he was able to push them back. So while the Vikings had been really successful in doing these quick raids on these towns and these villages, they really struggled when they came up against an organised army. So once the Vikings were defeated, they agreed that they would take in territory of land that became known as Danelaw. A lot of the Vikings came from Denmark, so this is why it was given this name. And this area known as Danelaw, which we can see in the pink there, was led by the king Guthrum. So the Vikings lived in this area quite peacefully, doing their own thing, passing their own laws and controlling this area. This, however, would change over a while, and this area would become quite difficult as the Anglo-Saxons tried to take some of the area back, and also the Vikings went into other areas. But at this point, the Vikings have a large territory of England, and they also, from this map you can see, they have lots of parts of Scotland as well. They've got Orkney, they've got Shetland, and they have a lot of areas around the north and in the Hebrides and the islands on the west coast. So the Vikings at this point are actually very powerful within Britain. This, however, all changes though in 954 AD. Eric Bloodaxe was overthrown and was later killed, and he controlled parts of Danelaw, which were gradually taken away by the Anglo-Saxons, and once the Anglo-Saxons got back York, Danelaw was taken away and there was no Vikings Viking rule in England. However, many Vikings decided to remain in England and carry on their life, but they had to do so under English rule. So Viking influence in England ended at this point. So with Eric Bloodaxe dead, Viking control of England ended, and there was no Viking raids on England for another 27 years. That was until King Sweyn of Denmark came to power. And in 991, he restarted the Viking raids on England. Now these were more brutal than any Viking raids that had been before. We looked at the examples at Iona and Lindisfarne, where they would take monks hostages and kill them. These were even more brutal, coming more inland and actually killing whole villages. Men, women and children were all killed in these attacks. Now the king at the time, to try and stop these attacks, tried to bribe the Vikings. So when the Vikings turned up, they would offer them money. Now King Sweyn, who was unusual as a king of the Vikings and actually coming on these raids, would sometimes take the money but then still go and pillage and damage these areas. But eventually what would happen when the Vikings came, they would demand massive sums of money and then they would leave. However, King Sweyn changed his tactics. In 1013, for a reason that we're not sure of, he decided that rather than just come and try to raid England, he would actually try and come and take it over and become king. So he came with a larger army than usual, and he was successful. He became the first Viking king of England. So while we have people like Guthrum and Bloodaxe who actually became kings of certain regions, King Sweyn of Denmark was the first Viking king to be the king of the whole of England. King Sweyn's time as King of England was very short-lived. He died only 5 weeks later. Now his son, whose name we take great care when pronouncing, is Knut or Canute, becomes King of England not until 3 years later. He had initially come with his dad to England on these raids and helped his dad actually take over England, but when his dad died, he was forced out of England and the Anglo-Saxons put one of their own as King of England. But he came back with 10,000 men and was involved in 14 months of battles. Now he had been with his dad, Canute. He'd seen these battles happen and he knew what was needed to overcome the Anglo-Saxons. So he was one of the first Viking kings to actually be properly trained in how to fight in these battles. So they weren't used to doing this sort of thing, the Vikings. They were used to just going into areas, raiding them, quick takeovers of these towns and villages. So he was very skilled in what he did. Now the skill of Canute shows in the fact that he successfully was King of England until 1035 when he died, and on this map we can see he controlled this large area of England which goes into modern day Scotland, but also Norway, Denmark and parts of Sweden as well. So he's a very successful king, knew how to lead his country, knew how to organise an army. And he was survived by his 2 sons who took over being King of England, firstly Harald I and then his other son Harthacnut. Now they didn't leave any heirs. So once they died, Harthacnut was succeeded by his half-brother, Edward the Confessor, who was an Anglo-Saxon. So no longer is England being ruled by a Viking, it's now being ruled by an Anglo-Saxon again. So because there wasn't an heir left, this means that the Vikings have now once again lost control in England. So Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon who takes over from Harthacnut, rules from 1042 till 1066. Now during this period the Vikings make no attempt to try and take over England. But when he dies, he doesn't have an heir either. So his first cousin once removed is William of Normandy from an area in France, and he says that because Edward didn't have an heir, he was promised to be king. However, his brother-in-law Harald Godwinson claimed he'd been promised the throne. Now he was just someone who was high up within the English earl system. Harald Godwinson took the throne with the support of the English earls and became Harald II. Now, so far we have Harald Godwinson. He's decided to crown himself the King of England, even though he knew he wasn't allowed to do that. He didn't really have the bloodline to take over this position, but he claimed he'd been promised the position and so he took it with the support of the high up English earls. In September 1066, Harald heard that Harald Hadrada, who was the king of Norway, had sailed over to Britain with a Viking army and had landed in York. Now, what made things worse is that Hardrada, who's the king of Norway, had Tostig, Harald Godwin's brother, with him. Now, Harald Godwinson had fallen out with his brother, so Tostig had joined Harald Hardrada's side. So now Harald Godwinson, who has forced himself to become King of England, has just taken up the position, and now he has the worry that he has the William of Normandy from France risking coming over to fight him, and he also has the King of Norway wanting to come to England to try and take over the country. So Hardrada does eventually come to Britain in 1066 in September, and he has success in the north of England. So Harald Godwinson realizes that he's going to have to go face this Viking army, and then he comes to Stamford Bridge for this battle. So the first task we want you to do is to look at these 10 events and trying to put them in order of how you think the battle went. So pause this video and see if you can arrange these into the order you think the Battle of Stamford Bridge went. So this is the correct order to copy into your jotter. Now we are going to watch a video on this shortly, which will hopefully bring it into more detail, bring it to life a bit more. But I'm just going to talk through the events, so hopefully it helps make more sense as you watch the video. Okay, so Hardrada's men had come to England. They'd had some small battles, but they weren't ready for the battle on the day it came. They were woken up suddenly, and much of their armour was on longships miles away. They didn't think Harald Godwinson was coming to fight them, so they weren't prepared at all. Hardrada's men are surviving, luckily, because they have a Viking soldier at the bridge holding off the Anglo-Saxons from crossing. Now, this Viking soldier is called a berserker. If you've heard the phrase of someone going berserk, someone going crazy, it comes from this Viking warrior. They wore bearskin, and they believed they had the protection of Odin, the Viking god, behind them, so they would just go crazy into these fights and try to take on a whole army by themselves. So Harald is being held off from the bridge, and Hardrada's men are being protected until this Viking soldier, this berserker, is killed. And once the Anglo-Saxons cross over the bridge, they can see that the Vikings don't have their full armour. The Vikings won't be able to use that shield wall, having all their circular shields together, protecting them in battle, and using the men behind them with the spears. So they can't protect themselves as they would. By midday, Harald's army is now in control, and Hardrada, the Viking king, is killed. So without their full armour, without their king trying to lead them in this battle, the Vikings are really struggling and quickly overpowered. And Tostig, who is Harald's brother, is found and cut into pieces. So King Harald eventually wins, and out of the 300 Viking ships that came to England for this attempt to take over the English throne, only 24 are needed to take the surviving Vikings home. So they are heavily defeated, and the Vikings will never recover and be able to have another attempt on England after this. Out of respect, Harald buries his brother Tostig in York, but then he has to turn his attentions to the south of England as the Duke of Normandy is arriving from France. So only just after defeating the Vikings and sending them away, he now has to go to the south of England. Okay, so we're going to watch a video which will dramatise that a lot better and hopefully make it more visual and clearer what happens. So try to take down some more facts other than the ones that you've copied into your jotter there, some facts about other things that happened in the battle that maybe were not mentioned.
Over the summer of 1066, the new king, Harald II, stationed his troops on the south coast of England. He had news of an impending invasion from William, Duke of Normandy, who was intent on deposing him. But strong northerly winds prevented the Duke's army from sailing across the Channel. On the 8th of September, Harald disbanded his troops and returned to London. But those same northerly winds actually helped propel the fleet of another invasion, this time in the north of England from the King of Norway. Now it was up to King Harold to put a stop to this bid for the English throne. Harold Godwinson had only been crowned king a few months earlier. He claimed that on his deathbed, King Edward the Confessor had named Harold heir to the throne. The Norwegian king, Harald Hadrada, was a giant of a man. His fearsome reputation earned him the nickname the Thunderbolt of the North. He believed he should be king because of an alleged promise to his deceased father. Hadrada was supported in his ambition by Tostig Godwinson, the embittered brother of the King of England. Hadrada and Tostig had already defeated the northern English earls on September the 20th at the Battle of Fulford. York had surrendered to them, and they had been promised hostages in return. As soon as King Harold heard of the Norwegian invasion, he gathered an army, raced north at lightning speed, mustering more troops as he went. All kings and noblemen had trained professional soldiers called housecarls, who lived in their household and protected and defended them both in peace and war. The housecarls were supported by part-time soldiers who made up a militia called the Fyrd. They were recruited from every village in England and had to defend their local area and provide their own food and equipment. On the afternoon of Monday the 25th of September 1066, the English army arrived at a place known as Stamford Bridge. The king had travelled just under 300 kilometres in only 5 days. It was here that Hadrada and Tostig had set up camp. They were resting, celebrating their earlier victories and awaiting delivery of the hostages they'd been promised. Not expecting any trouble, they had left their armour behind at their ships 25 kilometres away, bringing only weapons, shields and helmets. Suddenly, they noticed a huge army racing towards them. The Norwegians had been taken completely by surprise. The only thing that separated the Norwegian king from the English was the River Derwent, with just a narrow bridge and 2 nearby fords, allowing access to the other side. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, a ferocious, unarmoured Viking berserker held back the whole of the English army from crossing the bridge. He killed 40 English single-handedly until a cunning soldier paddled under the bridge and thrust a spear through the wooden slats and into the axeman. Harold's army stampeded across the bridge. Hadrada sent 3 riders on the fastest horses to return to the fleet and fetch his reserve warriors. He then ordered his troops to create a defensive shield wall on top of the hill on the eastern side of the river. Harold's army, almost twice as large as Hadrada's, also formed a shield wall and advanced up the hill. Before the main battle commenced, King Harold tried to persuade his brother Tostig to swap sides, offering to reinstate him as Earl of Northumbria. But when Tostig demanded to know what his ally Hadrada could have, the king spat, 7 feet of land for a grave. The battle began. The Norwegians were hopelessly outnumbered, and their line began to break as the English advanced. Hadrada then moved forward, swinging weapons in both hands, despite having neither a shield nor long mail shirt for protection. But it was a bad move. Hadrada was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed. Tostig was also slain. As the last Norwegians fled, the reinforcements from the ships finally arrived, too late to save their king. Florence of Worcester's account of the battle in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles records how Hardrada's son Olaf survived the fighting and gave himself up to the English king. But in an act of mercy, Harold allowed Olaf to return to Norway with those who survived, providing they swore an oath of loyalty to him and promised never to invade again. Out of Hardrada's vast fleet of more than 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The Viking threat had been driven from England once and for all. Harold had won. But only 2 days later, the winds turned to the south, and, as the sun went down, William, Duke of Normandy, set sail for England.
Now this picture shows Hardrada, the Viking king, bravely leading his army. But with his death ended the Viking Age in England. As we saw from the video, Hardrada's son Olaf promised that he wouldn't try to invade England again, and the Vikings never did. It was a heavy, heavy defeat for the Vikings, and they wouldn't recover from this, and they would never try to attack England again. But also, not long after, the Anglo-Saxon period would end as well. When Harald Godwinson went south to try and fight William of Normandy, he was also defeated. So not only in 1066 did the last Viking attempt on England end, also the Anglo-Saxon period end, as the Normans took over England and a new period began. Okay, so this is your main assignment, which you're going to be handing in through Teams, is to create a storyboard of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So choose 8 key events from the story and create a storyboard for it. It doesn't have to be across the whole battle. You can maybe choose a certain aspect of it, focus on maybe the end of the battle or the beginning of the battle. It's up to you how you want to lay this out. But you must include a picture and a sentence to explain each one. So you could do this in your jotter, or you could do it on Word, PowerPoint, however you want to do it. But please do this and upload it to Teams. Okay, and one last question just to finish with. What helped Harold Goodwin win the Battle of Stamford Bridge? What helped the Anglo-Saxons defeat the Vikings? Was it that Hardrada was killed early on in the battle and then couldn't lead the Vikings? Was it that the Vikings were caught unprepared and without armour? The fact that they didn't think that Godwinson was going to actually fight them, and that they left their armour and weapons, some of them, on the Viking longships? Or was it the Viking blocking the bridge was killed? If they'd managed to stay there for longer, would that have given the Vikings more time to get their weapons back from the longships? So try to see which one you think was most important for the Vikings winning. Thank you.